The Chicago morning air was crisp as Dr. Aisha Williams pulled her BMW into the physician parking garage at Chicago Memorial Hospital. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Monday, and today marked the beginning of a new chapter in her career. At 36 years old, she was about to become the youngest chief of staff in the hospital's 112-year history and the first black woman to hold the position. Aisha had earned this role through 15 years of relentless dedication: medical school at Johns Hopkins, residency in emergency medicine at Massachusetts General, fellowship in hospital administration at Mayo Clinic, 7 years as an attending physician and administrative director at Northwestern Memorial. Her credentials were impeccable, her leadership skills proven, and her vision for Chicago Memorial was exactly what the board had been seeking. She'd spent the previous week preparing for this moment, reviewing department budgets, meeting with key staff virtually, and planning her first 100 days. Today was supposed to be ceremonial, a morning meet and greet with the medical staff, followed by a formal introduction to the entire hospital at the 10 a.m. all-hands meeting. Adayaka grabbed her medical bag, checked her reflection in the car mirror, and headed toward the employee entrance. She wore her usual work attire, navy blue scrubs, comfortable sneakers, her stethoscope around her neck, and her white coat folded in her bag since she preferred to put it on once inside. The employee entrance led through the main hospital lobby, a soaring space with marble floors, modern lighting, and the constant flow of staff, patients, and visitors that defined a Level 1 trauma center. Aisha had been through this lobby dozens of times during her interview process and transition meetings, but always escorted by board members or administrators. Today was different. Today she was arriving on her own as staff. She approached the elevator bank designated for hospital employees, pulling her new ID badge from her bag. The badge had her photo, name, and title: Dr. Aisha Williams, Chief of Staff. She'd received it by courier 3 days ago and had been looking forward to using it. That's when she noticed the security guard. He was a thick-set white man in his early 50s, wearing the standard Chicago Memorial security uniform. His name tag read, T. Bradley. He stood directly in front of the elevator, arms crossed, watching people pass. Most staff members simply showed their badges and proceeded, but Aisha noticed something in how his gaze tracked her as she approached, a sharpening of attention, a subtle shift in posture. Aisha had experienced this look countless times throughout her life. The assessment, the suspicion, the assumption that she didn't belong in spaces of authority or expertise. She'd learned to navigate these moments with a combination of professionalism and strategic assertiveness. She held up her badge as she approached. "Good morning." Bradley stepped directly into her path, blocking access to the elevator. "Hold on, let me see that badge." His tone wasn't polite or professional. It was confrontational, immediately establishing a power dynamic. Aisha kept her voice calm. Of course. She held the badge closer so he could read it. Bradley barely glanced at it. "That's not enough. I need to see government-issued ID, driver's license or passport." Aisha noticed that the white physician who'd passed through 30 seconds before her hadn't been asked for additional identification. The hospital ID should be sufficient for employee access. "I determine what's sufficient," Bradley said, his voice rising slightly. "We've had issues with people using fake badges. I need to verify you are who you say you are." Aisha could see this escalating. She could push back, assert her authority, demand to speak to his supervisor. But she was also curious how far this would go. What would happen if she complied with every unreasonable demand? She pulled out her driver's license and handed it to him. Bradley examined it with exaggerated care, comparing the photo to her face multiple times. "This says you live in Evanston. What are you doing at this hospital?" "I work here," Aisha said evenly, "as indicated on my badge." Bradley pulled out his radio. "Yeah, this is Bradley at the main employee elevator. I've got someone here claiming to be hospital staff. Can you run a verification on?" He squinted at her badge. "Dr. Aisha Williams." Aisha felt her patience wearing thin. "Sir, I have a meeting in 10 minutes. I'm happy to provide whatever verification you need, but is this really necessary?" "Yes, it's necessary," Bradley snapped. "We take security very seriously here. If you're really a doctor, you should appreciate that." A static-filled voice came through Bradley's radio. "Bradley, what's the issue?" "Just verifying credentials on someone trying to access the staff elevator. Does she have a valid hospital ID?" Bradley hesitated. "Yeah, but..." "Then let her through. We're busy up here." Bradley's jaw tightened. He clearly wanted to continue the confrontation, but the direct order from dispatch left him little choice. He lowered his radio but didn't step aside. "I'm watching you," he said to Aisha, his tone threatening. "One wrong move and you're out of here." Aisha met his gaze steadily. "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again." She walked past him to the elevator. As the doors closed, she saw Bradley still watching her, suspicion and hostility radiating from his stance. Inside the elevator, Aisha took a deep breath. She pulled out her phone and made a quick note. 6:52 a.m., security guard, T. Bradley, main lobby, excessive ID verification, implied threats, compare treatment to white staff. She wasn't just the incoming chief of staff. She was also a black woman who'd spent her entire career documenting microaggressions and systemic bias. This incident would be addressed, but strategically and at the right time. The elevator opened on the 8th floor, where the executive offices were located. Aisha was immediately greeted by her new assistant, Maria Santos, a cheerful woman in her 40s who'd been with the hospital for 12 years. "Dr. Williams, welcome. How was your first morning navigating the building?" Aisha smiled. "Educational. Is the board assembled?" "Yes, they're waiting in the conference room. Coffee and breakfast are set up. You have 45 minutes before the department head meeting." Aisha entered the conference room to find 8 board members already seated. Dr. Robert Chen, the outgoing chief of staff, who was retiring after 20 years, stood to greet her. "Aisha, welcome. We're excited to have you leading this hospital." Handshakes went around the table. Aisha knew most of these people from her interview process, but this was different. Now she was their hire, their choice, their leader. Board Chair Margaret Foster, a distinguished woman in her 60s, gestured to the head of the table. "Please sit. We wanted to touch base before your official introduction this morning. How are you feeling?" "Ready," Aisha said confidently. "I've reviewed the strategic priorities we discussed. I have my first 100 days mapped out, and I'm looking forward to meeting the full staff." The conversation flowed through logistics, priorities and immediate challenges, but Aisha's mind kept returning to the interaction downstairs. It wasn't the worst discrimination she'd experienced, not by far, but it was emblematic of something she'd need to address in her new role. "Before we proceed," Aisha said, interrupting a discussion about budget allocations, "I want to raise something that happened this morning." She described the incident with Bradley, keeping her tone professional and factual. "I'm not bringing this up to complain or to get someone in trouble. I'm raising it because if a chief of staff can be profiled and harassed by security, imagine what black and brown patients, visitors and staff experience regularly." The room went quiet. Margaret Foster's expression darkened. "That's completely unacceptable." Dr. Chen nodded. "Tom Bradley has been here for 20 years. He's always been intense about security, but I've never heard about anything like this." "That's often how it works," Aisha said. "People in authority positions target those they perceive as less powerful. He probably wouldn't have treated a white male physician that way. He saw a young black woman and made assumptions." Margaret picked up her phone. "I'm calling Security Administration right now." "Wait," Aisha raised her hand. "I appreciate the impulse, but I'd like to handle this strategically. I'm new here. If I come in on day 1 and get a long-time security guard fired, it sends a message I don't want to send." "What message would that be?" one of the board members asked. "That I'm vindictive, or that I can't handle conflict, or that I use my position to punish people personally. I want to address this systemically, not just individually." She pulled out her tablet and opened her prepared presentation. "I've been reviewing our hospital's data on patient complaints, staff grievances, and incident reports. There's a pattern of Black and Latino patients reporting negative interactions with security, feeling profiled, having their pain undertreated because staff assume they're drug-seeking. This isn't about one guard, it's about culture." Aisha advanced through slides showing statistical disparities. "So here's what I propose. We conduct a full audit of security practices. We implement bias training for all staff, especially those in authority positions. We create clear protocols for how security interacts with patients and staff, and we make it clear that discrimination has consequences." Margaret was nodding. "I like this approach. It's comprehensive." And Aisha added, "I want to address Bradley directly, but not as retaliation, as education. Give him a chance to understand what he did wrong and do better." Dr. Chen looked skeptical. "You're more generous than I would be." "I'm strategic," Aisha corrected. "Real change doesn't come from firing one person, it comes from transforming systems. But Bradley will be part of that transformation, and if he can't or won't change, then we'll address termination." The board agreed to Aisha's plan. The meeting continued, covering the various priorities and initiatives she'd be leading. By 9:45 a.m. she was ready for her public introduction. The hospital auditorium was packed. 300 staff members, physicians, nurses, administrators, support staff, all gathered to meet their new chief of staff. Aisha stood backstage, listening to Margaret Foster's introduction. "It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Aisha Williams, a physician leader whose vision and expertise will guide Chicago Memorial into a new era of excellence and equity." Aisha walked onto the stage to warm applause. She took a moment to look at the diverse faces in the audience, medical professionals who dedicated their lives to healing, who deserved leadership that would support and champion them. "Thank you," Aisha began. "I'm honored to be here, and I'm excited about what we'll accomplish together. But before I talk about vision and strategy, I want to share something that happened to me this morning." She described the incident with Bradley, watching the audience's reactions. Some looked shocked. Others nodded in recognition, clearly having experienced similar treatment. "I'm sharing this not to embarrass anyone, but to illustrate a larger point. If I, as your chief of staff, can be profiled and questioned in our own lobby, what does that say about how we treat our patients, our visitors, our staff members who don't have titles or authority to push back?" The auditorium was completely silent now. "Excellence in healthcare requires excellence in how we treat people," Aisha continued. "All people, regardless of race, regardless of appearance, regardless of whether we assume they belong or not. So one of my first initiatives as Chief of Staff will be a comprehensive review of how we create welcoming, equitable environments for everyone who enters this hospital." She outlined her plan: bias training, policy reforms, accountability systems, and ongoing monitoring. This won't be easy. Change never is, but it's necessary. Because we can't heal patients in a system that harms them through bias and discrimination. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. After her speech, dozens of staff members approached to share their own stories, to thank her for addressing these issues, to express hope that real change was possible. Late that afternoon, Aisha met with Daniel Wright, the director of hospital security. He was a serious black man in his 50s, former Chicago PD, who'd been running hospital security for 8 years. "Dr. Williams, I want to apologize for this morning," Daniel said immediately. "I've already reviewed the incident with Bradley. His behavior was unacceptable." "I appreciate that," Aisha said. "What's your assessment of him?" Daniel sighed. "Tom's been here forever. He's good at the physical security aspects, watches for suspicious behavior, responds well to emergencies. But he's also old school. He makes assumptions. And honestly, I've had complaints before, especially from black staff and visitors. But he's protected by seniority and union rules." "Not anymore," Aisha said firmly. "Here's what's going to happen. Bradley will undergo mandatory bias training. He'll be formally counseled that his behavior this morning violated hospital policy, and he'll be on probationary status for 6 months. Any further incidents result in termination. I'll implement that immediately. One more thing," Aisha added. "I want to meet with him personally." Daniel looked surprised. "Are you sure? You don't need to subject yourself." "I'm sure. Schedule it for tomorrow morning, and I want you present as witness." The next morning, Tom Bradley sat in a small conference room, looking decidedly uncomfortable. Daniel Wright sat to his left, and Aisha sat across the table, her expression neutral and professional. "Mr. Bradley," Aisha began, "do you know who I am?" Bradley's face had been red since he'd entered the room. "Yes, ma'am. Dr. Williams, the new chief of staff." "That's right. The woman you profiled, harassed and threatened yesterday morning in the hospital lobby." Bradley's mouth opened and closed. In the 30 minutes before I arrived, 17 staff members entered through that elevator. 14 were white. 3 were people of color. Want to guess which ones you stopped?" Bradley didn't answer. "All 3, Aisha continued. "You stopped every single person of color who tried to use that elevator. You demanded additional ID from all of them. You questioned their right to be there. Meanwhile, white staff members walked right past you without any scrutiny." "That's not." "I didn't," Bradley stammered. "There's video evidence," Aisha said flatly. "This isn't about your intentions. This is about your actions and their impact." She leaned forward. "Here's what I need you to understand, Mr. Bradley. When you see a black woman in scrubs and immediately assume she doesn't belong, that's racial bias. When you demand additional verification from people of color that you don't demand from white people, that's discrimination. And when you do it in a hospital, you're not just violating policy, you're contributing to health disparities that literally kill people." Bradley looked genuinely confused. "I don't understand how security checks relate to health outcomes." Aisha pulled out her tablet and showed him research studies. "Black patients are less likely to be believed when they report pain.
They receive inadequate treatment because medical staff assume they're exaggerating or drug-seeking. And one factor that contributes to that is an environment where black people are constantly profiled and questioned. She showed him more data. When hospitals create hostile environments through security profiling, black patients delay seeking care. They don't come to the ER when they should. They don't follow up on symptoms. And they die from treatable conditions because they're avoiding places that make them feel unwelcome. Bradley was quiet, processing this information. So your actions yesterday morning weren't just rude or unprofessional, Aisha concluded. They were part of a systemic problem that contributes to people dying. Do you understand that? I never thought about it that way, Bradley said quietly. I know, that's the problem. You've been making assumptions based on race without thinking about the broader implications. Aisha handed him a document. You're being placed on probationary status. You'll complete mandatory bias training. And you'll work under increased supervision for the next 6 months. Any similar incidents will result in termination. Bradley took the document with shaking hands. Dr. Williams, I want you to know I'm not a racist. I don't hate black people. I didn't say you were a racist. Aisha interrupted. I said you engaged in discriminatory behavior. There's a difference. You can be a decent person and still have biases that lead to harmful actions. The question is whether you're willing to acknowledge those biases and change. She stood, indicating the meeting was over. I'm giving you this chance, Mr. Bradley. Don't waste it. Over the next 3 months, Aisha implemented sweeping changes at Chicago Memorial. The bias training wasn't just a checkbox exercise. It included scenario-based learning, data on health disparities, and accountability measures. Security protocols were revised to eliminate subjective profiling, and a new patient advocacy position was created to address discrimination complaints. Tom Bradley completed his training. The facilitator reported that he'd been initially defensive, but had gradually engaged with the material. He'd shared stories from his own life, admitting that he'd grown up in an all-white neighborhood and had limited interaction with people of color. He'd acknowledged making assumptions based on stereotypes. Whether he'd fundamentally changed remained to be seen, but his behavior improved. Complaints about him dropped to 0, and he'd started greeting all staff members, regardless of race, with the same level of professional courtesy. 4 months after her first day, Aisha was walking through the lobby when she saw Bradley at his usual post. He noticed her approaching and straightened up. Good morning, Dr. Williams. Good morning, Mr. Bradley. There was an awkward pause. Then Bradley said, I wanted to thank you. Aisha raised an eyebrow. For what? For not firing me. For giving me a chance to learn. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how my actions affect people, and you were right. I was making assumptions. Still am sometimes, but I'm catching myself now. Aisha studied him, looking for signs of insincerity but finding only earnestness. I appreciate you saying that. Change is hard. The fact that you're doing the work matters. Bradley nodded. I've been reading some of the materials from the training, about health disparities and implicit bias. I never knew any of that stuff. I thought I was just doing security, but I see now how I was part of a bigger problem. You still are, Aisha said gently. We all are. The system is biased, and we're all operating within it. But when we're aware of our biases and work to counteract them, we can make things better. After that conversation, Aisha noticed Bradley making extra efforts. He helped elderly black patients find their way through the hospital. He patiently answered questions from visitors who seemed overwhelmed. He was slowly and imperfectly becoming better. A year into her tenure as Chief of Staff, Aisha was invited to speak at a national healthcare leadership conference about her initiatives at Chicago Memorial. She stood before hundreds of hospital administrators and shared her first-day experience. I walked into my own hospital and was profiled by security, but instead of just punishing the individual, we used it as a catalyst for systemic change. We examined our policies, our training, our culture, and we committed to doing better. She showed slides of their outcomes: reduced complaints of discrimination, improved patient satisfaction scores among communities of color, higher staff morale, and notably, better health outcomes. Excellence and equity aren't competing values, Aisha concluded. They're intertwined. When we create environments where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, we provide better care. When we address bias in our systems, we save lives. That's not just the right thing to do morally. It's the right thing to do medically. The response was overwhelming. Over 50 hospitals reached out requesting consultation on implementing similar programs. Aisha spent the next year helping other institutions transform their cultures, always starting with the same message. Real change requires leadership, willing to acknowledge problems, staff willing to do difficult work, and systems designed for equity. 3 years after that first morning at Chicago Memorial, Aisha stood in the lobby watching staff and patients move through the space. Security guards greeted everyone with professionalism and warmth. Patients of all backgrounds were treated with dignity, and the culture had fundamentally shifted. Tom Bradley approached her, now 64 and planning to retire in a few months. "Dr. Williams, could I talk to you for a minute?" They stepped to a quieter corner of the lobby. "I wanted you to know," Bradley began, "that I'll be retiring soon. And I've been thinking about my time here, about the kind of security guard I was, and the kind I became." He looked directly at her. "You changed my life. That first day when you could have just had me fired but instead made me learn, that was a gift. I spent 20 years doing this job, and I'm only proud of the last 3. The rest I wish I could take back." "Bradley, growth is never wasted. You became the person you were capable of being. That matters. I've been talking to the new security hires," Bradley continued, "telling them about my mistakes, using myself as an example of what not to do. Maybe that's my small way of making amends." "That's not small," Aisha said. "That's powerful. When people own their mistakes and teach others, that's how culture changes." They shook hands, an unlikely connection forged through confrontation and transformation. As Bradley walked back to his post, Aisha thought about the journey of the past 3 years, the resistance to change, the slow progress, the setbacks and victories. She thought about all the Tom Bradleys in healthcare, people who'd operated on autopilot for years without examining their biases. And she thought about what was possible when leaders demanded better, when systems were redesigned, when people were given chances to grow instead of just being punished for failing. Real change was messy, complicated, and never complete, but it was possible. And at Chicago Memorial Hospital, it was happening.
Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.